We're staring right now at what could be called the fourth industrial revolution, where we're looking at the potential implications of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, nanotechnology, quantum computing, 5G wireless, 3D printing, applied genetics and genetic engineering, fully autonomous vehicles, decentralized sustainable energy, and the automation of most current jobs, right? So that's part of the context too, in that much of educational thinking has been geared toward getting a job, but the entire landscape of what that even means is going to change. Therefore, education should be aware of that and should be changing as well. So we need to take seriously the direction that we're heading in, and we need to take responsibility for the world that we're leaving our children. So these are things that as parents, as citizens, we have to think about. We can't just be thinking about parenting practices and what schools our children go to and what grades they're going to get and what college they're going to go to, because it's bigger than that. The context that they're living in is bigger than that. So this world of wicked problems, right? This world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it's a world where the problems are not just out there, like we have to look at ourselves and think about the relationships between what's happening in the world and our ways of thinking and our ways of understanding the world, so that we can think about what are the ways of thinking and understanding that our children are going to have if they're actually going to get some traction in making things better. Because complexity requires competence, right? So one way of thinking about what's happening right now is that our capacity to make sense of information is not increasing at the same rate as the complexity of information that we have access to. So we've lost our ability to make sense of our environment. So our number one charge as parents and as educators is helping our kids make sense of the world, right? And again, the media landscape has changed tremendously. The status quo around how you get your information has changed tremendously and is continuing to change. There's a lot of conflicting and competing information out there. We're living in what some people are calling a post-truth world, right? Or a world of truthiness, where it's sort of hard to tell what's really true and what's not. And we see that many people have different perspectives on things. But it's getting harder and harder to really claim any sort of objectivity or claim any sort of truthful, fact-based narrative that this is the real story and ignore those other narratives. So we have to find a way to make sense of that and find some larger overarching frameworks that are going to actually include those diverse voices without denying them, but also don't fall into a sort of relativism where every perspective is equal. So if we're going to actually think about any of these big problems, and if we're going to think about different ways of approaching education and parenting, we actually have to look at the diversity of perspectives themselves and see how they emerged, how they relate to each other, and how we make sense of that diversity. So that's some of what I'm going to be talking about, because we need a narrative, we need a story, right? We need to be able to help our children make sense of the world. So in order to do that, I suggest we actually just take a step back, take a deep breath. All right, what is the evolutionary context that shapes us in our world? I think that's an important question. What is our grand narrative, right? And what are the implications of that for how we should be raising and educating our children? So evolution can be looked at in a lot of different ways. One way to think about it is just as the increase of complexity. That's actually one way of thinking about what's been happening for the past 13, 14 billion years, is that organisms have been getting more complex. Networks and relationships amongst what exists has been getting more complex. And that complexity goes hand in hand with an increase in consciousness or subjective experience as well, right? So we see that more complex manifestations are coming into being. And those complex manifestations, like human beings and other animals on Earth, as far as we know, are very aware of what's happening, and we're starting to become aware of evolution itself, right? So everything that we're going to be thinking about is in that context. Because human development is just one aspect of this evolutionary process, right? And education can actually be seen as the process through which we determine how to support and foster and direct the evolution of our species, right? So I think that big frame is actually helpful when we're trying to deal with some of these big picture problems, like the wicked problems of climate crises and economic collapse and the need for global solutions. We need a broader and deeper understanding of this evolutionary context that is able to make sense of different perspectives within that context. Because one thing, too, that we need to be thinking about is how evolution is not just about material things or animals. It's actually about insides and outsides. So like subjective experience is evolving along with objective experience, and what's the relationship between those things. And we can identify directionality and trends that we need to connect to how we're developing as human beings. So I'm suggesting that this could be part of a big story or a grand narrative that can actually weave together different perspectives and kind of be potentially healing and liberating and helpful for humanity as we try to figure out where we've come and where we're going. So as we look through history, thinking about not just in terms of material evolution, but the evolution and the emergence of worldviews, right? So you can see patterns emerging in humanity across time of different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking, different ways of organizing society. And we can see some cross-cultural, quasi-universal patterns emerging. So this connects to what a philosopher named Hansi Freinacht calls the great stretching out, where over time we see this stretching out of perspectives and we see different values and different ways of organizing the world, and more keep emerging, but the ones that already emerge still exist in different forms. So it just becomes more and more complicated in terms of navigating these different worldviews and these different structures all at the same time, because they don't go away, they just keep building on each other and changing. And we can also shift between systems of production, size of social groups, and structures of thought. So one way to think about that is as a 4-quadrant framework. I'm sharing this. This was developed by Ken Wilber as part of his integral theory as a way of trying to create a non-reductive meta-theory, so a way of organizing different ideas about what's happening. And I think it's a really crucial insight to see that as we think about how things are changing and developing, that you really can't reduce, for instance, our subjective experience to our objective bodies, right? You can't reduce what's happening in our cultures or our intersubjective we space to our systems of production. Like, none of these aspects of reality are reducible. They all are real. They can all be studied independently, but they all relate to each other in different ways. So when we're thinking about the kind of crises that we're facing, it's sort of a good checkpoint for us to think about, are we taking a holistic sort of integral view on what's happening? Are we thinking about what's happening in terms of our subjectivity and our consciousness? Are we thinking about behavior, systems, and culture, and all these things and how they relate to each other? And what's interesting to see in history is that at different times, sort of different areas of life sort of take precedence or have a big impact on the others. And it seems like right now we are living in an age where we're being pushed down an ever narrower path in response to environmental pressures and technological change. So you could think of this lower right quadrant of systems, which includes technology and social systems, and how that's having a huge impact on our behavior and our thinking and our culture, right? So you can think of it as being sort of out of balance, like what's happening in the exterior world, sort of runaway technology, runaway progress, having economic global structures that nobody really understands or can really control. It's kind of getting out of hand, and our sort of interior evolution is not keeping pace, right? Like our thinking and our cultural way of making meaning is not really in right relationship with the evolution of our social world. So that is a framework that can be empowering for us in terms of just seeing what needs to happen. We need to bring it back in balance. We need to find a way to actually update our operating systems, update the ways that we make sense and think and perceive and interpret, so that we can actually be in a better relationship to the exterior world and kind of bring it back into harmony, right? So that's a big picture idea there. So another question that arises if we're thinking about these things is, what are the relationships between evolution and human development, right? And then obviously as we're thinking about human development, that takes us right into thinking about education and parenting. So what are our potentials as adults to keep growing? This framework on the right is based on Piagetian theory, going through basic cognitive structures of development, which many people are familiar with. But it does sort of beg the question, what's next? What are further human potentials? And what's been happening for the past 30, 40, 50 years is many different models are being developed that help explain what the possibilities are for adult human development and for post-formal development, meaning beyond simple, formal, operational, rational, logical thinking. What are the capacities available to us? The better we understand those capacities, the better we understand what the potentials of our children are, the better we can shape educational systems that are actually geared toward helping children to reach those higher potentials, because those are the higher potentials that are going to enable people to actually respond intelligently to the complexity of the social world, right? So all these things can start to come together. As we're thinking about theories of human development, I'm going to go into talking about some aspects of human development. It's really important to keep in mind that all theories are dependent on particular methodologies, particular assessments that are done. So there's many different models, there's many different assessments, there's many different theories that have been developed. What's really interesting is seeing how they overlap and seeing what patterns emerge, and not falling into the trap of thinking that any one theory is really going to explain humanity, and to not fall into a sort of myth of the given as though, well, this is the way it is. So once we understand this, then we understand everything. It's not what I'm suggesting. We're always going to enact different theories based on different data, which is collected through different models and assessments. But what's interesting is that we definitely see patterns emerging across different theorists and theories and assessments and models, so that we can see a bigger picture emerging in terms of what's possible. There's different ways to break down stages. There's different ways to characterize stages. But something's happening, right? It's not real just because there are disagreements or there's different ways to think about things. You can still see these broader truths that can weave different perspectives together into a larger framework, which is sort of what I'm aiming for here, is to sketch out what would a sort of broad meta theory be that can bring together lots of different theories and lots of different fields of information to make sense of our world and of ourselves as much as we can. And the more conscious we become, the better our models of understanding of development will become, right? And the more sophisticated our relationship to those models will be, right? So if you take a less complex approach to complexity in human development, you're going to end up with something really destructive, like the eugenics movement, right? Or associating development with race, or like making all kinds of mistakes that can happen, right? There's a great book called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould, which kind of goes through a history of all the terrible ways that we've tried to measure each other and rank each other and create power hierarchies out of pseudo-natural hierarchies, right? But as we're getting to a better place in terms of our research and our own thinking and our society, we can actually develop more sophisticated understandings of development so that we don't fall into those traps, but we also don't fall back on just denying that there is a such thing as development, right? Because that's not helpful either. So we're not talking about kinds of people, we're talking about available perspectives, right? Perspectives that are available to everyone. You could think of them as frequencies or wavelengths or patterns or probabilities of consciousness. We're talking about the structures, styles, and limits of the voices inside our heads, basically, right? And those voices are not us either. Those voices are things that we can identify with, but they're actually being influenced by our environment and our relationships, our families, and our educational systems, right? So that's one way of sort of understanding what's happening. As we grow up and we learn different ways of making sense of the world, we can see this development of human values and symbols emerging over time, both individually and collectively. So there's this unfolding spiral of values and identity. You can think of them as value memes, right? So what we think of as traditional society can be aligned with what is sort of in the middle there, the blue, around order, hierarchy, purpose, rules. That was the foundation of many human societies for the past few thousand years, right? But then a different sort of order of value emerged, which is often identified with modernity and the scientific enlightenment and revolution around rationality, science, progress, right, individualism. And this is largely the legacy that we're living with today, so it's great to be able to identify it and see, oh, okay, this value structure emerged. This has had a huge impact on the Western world and now globally over the past couple hundred years. And we can also see since then, which has really become very present in the past 50 or 60 years, is this more green value structure, right? And it is often thought of as green because it's taking a more systems perspective, thinking about compassion, sensitivity, networking, diversity, a sort of green ecological awareness, a critique of modernity, right? Modernity was a critique of traditional sort of mythological belief and the emergence of science out of mythical religious belief. Postmodernity emerged as a critique of modernity. And what we're seeing now is actually the time is ripe to have thoughtful critiques of postmodernity, right? And thoughtful critiques of this green value meme, because that value structure that has emerged, which we can see in many positive developments in society, is actually not solving the problems of modernity, right? Partly because it's too hung up on a critique of modernity, a critique of progress, a critique of linear rationality. But we need to move beyond critique and get toward actually reconstructing or constructing more positive solutions, right? And not just being stuck up on deconstructing everything. Because where that leaves us, that sort of green value structure that has emerged, which is very fixated on critiquing modernity and, all the disasters that came from modernity, but kind of forgetting the dignities and wonderful things that came from modernity. But it can leave us in this sort of relativistic space, which ties into what I was saying before about how the world that we're living in right now can be thought of as sort of a post-truth world, because it's hard to really know where to put your foot down. We can see the problems and the limits of these different ways of thinking, but it doesn't really leave us with any clear answers. And what we need to figure out is, how do we provide clear answers for our children, right? So we all have a meaningful background framework, but we're not always thinking about it. We're not often looking at it because we're too busy looking through it, right? So one of the intentions of a talk like this is just to give us a sense of taking that backward step and becoming metacognitive about how we think about things, how we're structuring reality, how we're interpreting reality, because that's conducive to our own growth and development. Another key point here is that as we're going through the stages, both individually and collectively as a society, ideally we're transcending and including, right? So as we move beyond the limits of traditional society, we still want to include the good things about traditional society, right? Like the importance of connection and relationship, and rules and order are actually very important, right? And healthy hierarchy actually can be very important too. And as we move beyond modernity and we get beyond really destructive forms of capitalism and colonialism and scientific materialism, which has sort of lost the spirituality of life, as we move beyond that, we still want to keep the benefits of scientific thinking, rational thinking, and all that good stuff. Similarly, as we move beyond postmodernity, we want to include how we can now critique systems, critique modernity, have more green values, but not get stuck in a relativistic place where we can't really have a larger narrative, right? One way of thinking about postmodernity is just denying any meta-narratives, right? Like, nobody has the right to have a big story anymore. Nobody has the right to say this is the way it is, because you can just look at their positionality and say, oh, well, you're just this person from this place, and that's your perspective, so what you're saying really has no relevance to everyone else. And we've got to find a way to get beyond that, and I think taking a bigger picture about how perspectives evolve can help us to do that. So we want to avoid developmental blindness, right? We want to avoid going through life not acknowledging the ways that development really has a huge impact. It's not the only thing going on. There are so many psychological, emotional, cultural, social influences on our world. But if we actually have a pretty coherent developmental frame, it really does help us explain a lot of what's going on in the world. So we don't want to deny that or lose that. So these are models from Kurt Fisher and Michael Commons, both who worked out of Harvard, both who looked at different ways at the development of complexity, right? So this is one way of thinking that I think is crucial for thinking about education and parenting, because one of the things that we want to be doing is developing the complexity of our children's thinking, right? And that should be really the cornerstone of the educational process, is how are we moving children through these stages so that they're becoming more conscious and more complex as they get older, and not getting stuck, right? And not having arrested development based on thinking the way that their parents think or their peers think or mainstream society thinks, right? We want to move them through in as healthy a way as we can, as far as they can, so that they can be the system changers and system transformers of the future. So if we're thinking about cognitive complexity, we're thinking about an equilibrium of behavior, right? We're thinking about a form of behavior within a range of complexity in relation to an environment. So you move from constructing stories of sort of concrete facts at the concrete stage, to then finding abstract variables in those stories, to finding formal relationships between those variables, to then finding systems of relationships at the systematic level, to then finding common properties of different systems at the at the metasystematic level, to then developing paradigms that explain the principles across the relationships of systems, right? So it just keeps getting more and more complex, but by including the previous stage. So it is a natural hierarchy. It's a growth hierarchy. It's not necessarily a moral hierarchy. It's not better or worse, but it is a structural, inherent hierarchy of complexity, where each stage coordinates the actions of the preceding stage. So again, when we think about formal thinking, that's sort of the cognitive foundation for what we think of as traditional agricultural society, right? You can have simple if-then relationships, but you find people still tend to stick to linear plans and rules that are determined by others, and they can't necessarily bring all those rules together in a coherent system of thought, right? So if you think about traditional mythic religious belief, there's lots of contradictions. There's lots of rules and if this, then that, but it doesn't always all hang together, right? There are some inconsistencies. There are some contradictions. There are some ways that it's not fully comprehensive, right? Because it's not really systematic yet. If we think about the systematic structure, we're thinking about the foundation of modern science and culture and modernity, right? So we're thinking about liberalism, socialism, and secularism, and how those more systematic ways of thinking kind of swept through society and culture and led to radical changes. And when we're thinking about the metasystematic thinking, we're thinking about more of postmodernity, right? Being able to critique systems, being able to critique the systems that we've created through industrialization, through modernity, and more both and thinking, right? That's not the end of the trajectory, but if we can at least get more people to that metasystematic thinking and paradigmatic thinking, we'll be in a much better position to actually respond to the complexity of the systems that we're embedded in. So thinking about education and where people are at and where we need to go, it's really helpful to get a sense of where we're at now, right? So this is some older data, but this is from Robert Keegan, who's also out of Harvard. He has different ways of framing it, but these same basic structures overlap, right? So he has, again, different assessments, different models, different theories, but the overlap is really interesting because what he calls the socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and the self-transforming mind do broadly overlap with what we think of as traditional, modern, and postmodern society, right? And again, he's framing this notion of the development gap where most people are in over their heads, right? So the name of a great book is In Over Our Heads, which really goes through lots of really great examples of how people in the modern world do not have the capacity and the competence to really respond appropriately to the environments that they're in, whether it be in education or professionally or in politics. We're like always trying to catch up, and we're not really preparing people to be where they need to be to really make sense of it all and make proactive, thoughtful, intelligent decisions. And that's what we need our children to be doing. That's what we need to be doing. And if we're not there yet, we need to reflect on that and continue our own education and our own learning. Because if you look at some data that's been collected, most people are hovering between this socialized and self-authoring stage. So they're starting to disembed themselves maybe from their family, from their society, and their self-authoring, but they're not really criticizing the systems they're embedded in. They're not really seeing how different systems relate to each other. And they're not really in a more self-transforming space where the perspective that they're taking is actually enabling them to create new categories of meaning, to create new relationships to the environment, to actually make things different than they are, and to take a post-conventional perspective on their social reality. So our children will need to be self-transforming if they're going to be system-transforming, right? And we need genuine individuation and not just modern or postmodern conformism, right? So that's another point that I forgot to mention, which is that a child growing up in a postmodern context can learn the language games of postmodernity and learn to sound like they're really critical of modern society, but they end up in a really cynical, unhealthy place because they haven't themselves necessarily gone through those stages where they're really seeing those things for themselves. They're just actually coming at it from a socialized mind, adapting to a postmodern context. But that doesn't mean that they have a high degree of complexity in their own thinking. So there's a difference between aligning with the sort of cultural codes of your family or your subculture and actually going through the stages of development yourself. So we actually need to be thinking about education in terms of not playing political correctness games, not teaching kids to think a certain way or say certain things or always be thoughtful and sensitive about the words that they use, but actually challenging their thinking every step of the way so that they're doing the internal work to really go through the stages themselves. So that's a crucial difference. What we have happening now is that as this sort of postmodern metasystematic thinking is becoming more prevalent and more dominant, we see a lot of young kids aligning with it really easily, right? And you could see a lot of this, not to take anything away from it, but in the youth movement toward climate change, it's a great thing. I think it's important. But if you actually did psychological assessments of the millions of kids who are involved, I doubt many of them are really at a self-transforming stage of consciousness, right? They're not really able to think through all the relationships and all the dynamics yet. They're just getting swept up in their current mode of socialization, right? So maybe that's better than what they would have been swept into 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I would argue that it is better, but there's still a crucial difference there. And we need to not let that be good enough and keep challenging our kids to really think through the complexities. We need to be able to have difficult conversations where we're acknowledging different sides of an issue and not just gearing them towards, no, this is the one right way to think about things. Carbon is bad, and everyone should be driving electric cars, and people on that side of the political spectrum are bad, and we're the good guys. That's not complex thinking, right? And that's not the answer for developing more complex thinkers. And that's a crucial thing for postmodern parents to hear, because many of us in this space of even thinking about this are resonating with certain green values, and we want to transmit those values to our children. And that's all well and good, but it's different than thinking through what is actually involved in helping our kids go through that sequence for themselves. So we're going to talk more about that. So just to summarize what I've covered so far, right? We have increasing complexity. We have the emergence of different values, which also transcend and include each other. And we have different cultural codes. So we have this difference between content and structure, where the content of what you think is not necessarily a representation of how complex your structure of thinking is. So we want to be able to untangle that when we're thinking about education. But the main point is that human development is the meta-crisis of our time, right? We have lots of crises happening in the world, but the sort of meta-crisis that's informing it all is, where are we as a culture, as a society, as a species, in terms of our ability to keep responding and adapting and developing. So we need to see the process that's happening, and we need to learn how to change the social games that we're playing. We're only going to be able to do that from at least a metasystematic stage, but probably a paradigmatic stage, and getting beyond some of the cultural traps of postmodernity into whatever a postmodern world would look like. That's what we actually need to be developing right now. Some people are calling it metamodern. Some people are calling it integral. I will talk more about that toward the end too. But it really is about trying to understand the whole spectrum of symbol stages in order to create a society that solves the major problems of modern life, not just critiques modern life, and about seeing everyone and everything as a part of an emergent process of unfolding perspectives, and the seeing relationships between those perspectives and our environments, and how our inner worlds and our outer worlds co-constitute each other, right? Because that is the framework we want to bring to education. We want to be developing environments that support the overall emergence of human consciousness. We don't want to be stuck in limited or limiting structures that sort of arrest our children's development.